Eden Wilson reporting, and that University of Liverpool poll revealed that Michelle O'Neill was likely to be First Minister after the next election, as Sinn Féin came top on 23%. The DUP were in second on 19.5%, with Alliance rising to third place on 15.5%. The Ulster Unionists were on 14%, while the SDLP were on 10%. The TUV and the Greens were both on 6.5%, while People Before Profit were on 2.3%. Well, to discuss it all, I'm joined by the lecturer and political writer David McCann and Anna Mercer from the political consulting firm Stratagem. Anna, to start with you, how do you interpret these findings?
Well, I think it's really interesting that it's the collapse of the DUP vote rather than Sinn Féin's ascendancy, because Sinn Féin votes down on what it was in 2017. But I think for Jeffrey Donaldson, he will be looking at this pretty panicked, thinking, is the tactic on pulling out of the First and Deputy First Minister's office really going to convert into votes for me? When we look at the findings from the poll, the protocol was, I think, fourth on the list. So he really needs to make the point to his voters about why it matters to them. What has this got to do with health? What's it got to do with the cost of living crisis? And how is it relevant to their day-to-day? Sinn Féin will be pretty happy with it. I think they will lose a couple of seats. I mean, we talk about Sinn Féin becoming the First Minister, and the message sounds really positive, but actually there is a story of loss there, and the big rise is amongst the other voters and the Alliance Party, as well as the Greens and People Before Profit, set to make gains. So I think what we're really seeing is the disruption of, the dominance of the big two, and the introduction of the other designation becoming a much more significant player.
David, why do you believe that it's been so negative for the DUP?
Well, a couple of things. They haven't really had the impact that they wanted from the resignation of Paul Givan. The DP seem to be auguring for a snap election, so an election in March. Brandon Lewis has scuppered that by putting through the New Decade New Approach changes, which prolongs the period for collapse of the executive. The other thing, I think Anna's alluded to this as well, is that the protocol doesn't really seem to be biting, and this is problematic for Jeffrey Donaldson. Don't forget, Jeffrey Donaldson left the Ulster Unionist Party just as it was about to begin that nosedive, and if this poll is accurate, the DUP are on to cop a swing against it that is on par with the swing that David Trimble endured in 2005 when the Ulster Unionists at Westminster level were all but wiped out. So the DUP have some vulnerable seats there. It isn't all bad for them. There is a sense in the poll that there are a lot of undecideds out there, particularly within unionism. So he can still maybe get some traction and gain some ground back that he's lost, because the DP have really had a torrid political year.
But Anna, 10% for the SDLP will not be good news for Colm Eastwood.
No, it won't. The SDLP will be disappointed with that. However, poll after poll, the SDLP have been expected to, they've written the obituary for the SDLP, and they have maintained at 10 to 12% fairly consistently now in the past few elections. I think the real frustration for them is they haven't had a bad couple of years. They haven't really put a foot wrong. They've the emergence of some really good speakers. You have Claire Hanna, you have Colm Eastwood.
So why is this not reflected, do you believe, in the poll?
I don't think they're able to define themselves against, for what they're for as opposed to what they're against. When you're in a power sharing executive, you have to go along with the majority, with collective responsibility. So I think for them, it really is, taking a good look at whether opposition is the option for them, and how do they re-energise their voter base? What do they do about the encroachment of, the Alliance Party, who are set to overtake them? How do they appeal to more people, and how can they really talk to their electorate?
And things are looking up for both Alliance and the Ulster Unionists in this poll, David.
Yeah, well, Alliance are the ones who are really set to gain. And the unique thing about Alliance this time is, up until about 10 years ago, Alliance were really regarded as a small unionist party. They fished predominantly in a unionist electoral pond. This time, half of the gains that Alliance are expected to make are going to be at the expense of the nationalist parties, Sinn Féin and the SDLP. And at the moment, neither Sinn Féin nor the SDLP have seen that they can actually rebut that. They don't know how to take on Naomi Long, because they haven't to in the past. The other rise that's going on here, I think, is the Greens are tapping into a bit of that vote in constituencies like South Belfast, East Belfast and North Belfast. They'll be taking those votes. For the Ulster Unionists, only up a point. Again, it's worth remembering, in 2003 and in 2017, the Ulster Unionist Party went up by a similar percentage share, and they fell back in seats. So, Doug will be happy, because he's had a bit of a bad couple of weeks, that it hasn't gone down, but still they're not making the breakthrough.
And you can't ignore the TUV.
You can't. You can never ignore Jim Allister. He is always there, and the DUP are always looking over their shoulder at him. I think, to be honest, though, he has never really been able to. Well, he's never increased his representation in his party beyond one. So it's always the threat there. But translating that into seats is another question. I mean, David probably can tell you more about that. But you actually need to get enough votes in each constituency, and they don't have the Jim Allister effect in every.
But isn't it interesting too that many unionist voters are not that exercised by the protocol?
Indeed, and I think it was a risky strategy, but what the DUP have essentially done is taken a note out of the Sinn Féin playbook in 2017. When they're worried their voters are just showing apathy, they need them to get angry, and they need them to get angry at something, this perceived wrongdoing. We've heard Jeffrey Donaldson talking, using language like unfairness, very similar to Sinn Féin in 2017 in relation to respect and equality, and when they were talking about the RHI and about the Irish language issues. So, I mean, they're copying them, but I think it's a bigger risk because that was 5 years ago. We've had 2 years of a pandemic and 3 years of no assembly.
This is a poll. It's not the poll, but how bitter do you expect the forthcoming election to be, David?
I think that it will probably be a bit contentious at the start, but then I think it will largely settle down because, people are focusing on, and that poll has shown it, they are focusing on issues like healthcare, cost of living. I don't think it will be as much dominated by those constitutional issues. Why do I think that? Because the rise of the United Community, the other designation, don't forget the people who are really making noticeable gains here are the Alliance Party, the Green Party, People for Profit. The other parties are going to have to respond to that. And again, whether they can is another question.
And yet 1 voter in 5 doesn't know which way to vote.
And I think that leaves the potential for the other 4 parties to gain. Again, voters are waiting to be wooed. They're clearly not hearing enough yet. But again, you could see Alliance and the Greens really capitalising on that with a time for change message, particularly if the other parties can't get their act together.
Anna, the executive is down and we cannot be sure that there will be a new executive post an election.
Well, it's not completely down. We still have ministers in office. They are still there in a bit of a caretaker role. And the new legislation that passed next week means that they can continue in office until a new executive is formed. So it's a bit of a safety net for, to ensure that departments can keep on running. I do expect that there will be, that we need time after an election to work out what to do next. But that's not unique to Northern Ireland. That, in the Republic, it took 4 months to form a government. Coalition governments are really hard. Prior to the changes in the legislation last week, I think it's 14 days to form a government. That's hard when you're dealing with 5 parties. But of course, it will all come down to how this message about Sinn Féin First Minister or will DUP be Deputy First Minister or not. But I think it's a bit of a distraction. We know it's kind of meaningless. We know it's just language, but I think it's the symbolic impact of the of unionism losing its hold.
It's always fascinating to talk politics, particularly on this programme. Anna, David, thank you both very much indeed.